In 1958, the United States Department of Agriculture quietly published Home and Garden Bulletin number 56, a 41-page pamphlet that taught American housewives how to put up a winter's worth of food for under $9 using nothing but salt, lye, vinegar, and a cool corner of the basement. 11 years later, the same agency was telling those same women that home preservation was, and I am quoting the 1969 revision now, a serious risk to family health. Nothing in the chemistry had changed. The science had not been overturned. What changed was that General Foods, Swift, and a handful of grocery chains had figured out how to sell the housewife back the very thing she used to make for free. Number 7 on this list is the reason your grandmother could feed a family of 6 through a Pennsylvania February on roughly 14 cents a day, and the reason almost nobody under 60 knows how to do it anymore. Between roughly 1948 and 1972, a very specific set of pantry tricks was systematically pulled out of American kitchens, and it did not happen by accident. The Food and Drug Administration, the USDA, the National Canners Association, and a procession of brand new convenience food companies spent 24 years rewriting what a normal pantry was supposed to look like. Crocks went into garages. Root cellars were paved over for laundry rooms. Salt barrels were replaced by freezers, and freezers were replaced by trips to Kroger and Safeway. Each step was sold as progress, and each step quietly transferred a piece of household sovereignty into somebody else's profit and loss statement. The story you were told was that these tricks were dangerous, dirty, primitive, or simply too much work for a modern family. The story you were not told is that almost every single one of them was banned, regulated out of practical existence, or quietly stripped from Extension Office curricula during a single 25-year window after the Second World War. Your grandparents lived on the last side of that line. They still knew how to walk into a barn in November and walk out with a year's protein. They still knew how to look at a windfall apple pile and see medicine, not garbage. We forgot. Here is what they knew, and here is exactly how each piece of it worked before the institutions in question decided you did not need to know it anymore. Number 1. The dry salt cure for a whole pork side. In 1947, the USDA's own Farmer's Bulletin 1186 recommended that any family slaughtering a hog in November should reserve roughly 1¼ pounds of coarse salt for every 10 pounds of meat, plus 4 ounces of brown sugar and 1 ounce of saltpeter, and rub the mixture into a pork side every 3 days for 6 weeks. Done correctly, the bacon would hang in a smokehouse for 18 months without refrigeration, and the ham would still be safe at room temperature 3 full summers later. The trick works because salt at roughly 6% concentration in the meat's moisture binds free water so tightly that bacteria cannot metabolize it. Sugar feeds a slow lactic ferment on the surface that drops pH and rounds the flavor. The saltpeter, sodium nitrate, fixes the color, blocks botulism spores, and gives the finished product the deep rose color you associate with a Christmas ham. 3 ingredients, 1 cold cellar, and a calendar. That is the entire trick. The total cost in 1947 was about $3.40 for a side that would feed a family well into the following spring. Then, in 1971, the FDA began its first formal review of nitrate use in home cures, and by 1978, the agency had quietly convinced extension offices in 26 states to stop teaching the technique to 4-H clubs. The official reason was consumer safety. The unofficial reason is that Hormel and Oscar Mayer had built a $2 billion wet cure industry that depends on you not knowing how cheap dry salt is. Your grandfather hung his own bacon in a smokehouse he built with his own hands out of scrap chestnut, and he paid almost nothing for the privilege. You rent yours by the slice from a refrigerated case under fluorescent light, and you pay roughly $8 a pound for the same chemistry he did at home for 16 cents. Number 2. The staged root cellar. A properly built American root cellar in 1935 was not a hole in the ground. It was a 4-zone climate machine. Zone 1, nearest the door, held 50 degrees Fahrenheit and about 60% humidity for onions, garlic, and winter squash. Zone 2, deeper in, held 38 degrees and 90% humidity for carrots packed in damp sand, parsnips left in their dirt, and turnips layered in straw. Zone 3, the coldest corner, sat at 32 degrees for cabbages hung by their roots, and apples stacked in single layers on slatted shelves. Zone 4 was a dry shelf above the door for dried beans, seed corn, and herbs. A family of 5 could hold roughly 600 pounds of produce from October to April with no electricity, no compressor, and no monthly utility bill. The mechanism is pure passive physics. Earth at 4 feet of depth holds a stable 50-degree thermal mass year-round. Evaporation off damp sand pulls a refrigeration effect, and ethylene-producing fruits, like apples, are deliberately staged away from sprouting roots, like potatoes. A 1937 Pennsylvania State College agricultural circular documented that a properly staged cellar lost less than 8% of stored produce over a 6-month winter. The Rural Electrification Administration, founded in 1935, spent the next 30 years convincing rural Americans that refrigeration was the modern equivalent. By 1965, the standalone root cellar had been replaced in nearly 70% of new American homes by a single 14 cubic foot General Electric freezer that consumed roughly 1,200 kilowatt hours a year and held about a quarter of what the cellar used to. They did not ban dirt. They just stopped putting it in the building plans. Number 3, the open crock lacto-fermented kraut. Between 1900 and 1955, almost every German, Polish, and Pennsylvania Dutch household in the upper Midwest kept a 5-gallon stoneware crock in a back pantry running a slow cabbage ferment from October until March. The mechanism is almost embarrassingly simple. Shredded cabbage, 2.25% salt by weight, a weighted plate, and patience. Lactobacillus bacteria already living on the cabbage leaf metabolize plant sugars into lactic acid. The pH drops below 4.0 within about 10 days, and at that point, the kraut is biologically immortal at cellar temperature, because no pathogenic organism known to food science can survive in that environment. A single 5-gallon crock yielded roughly 40 pounds of finished kraut for the cost of cabbage and salt, with a vitamin C content high enough that British and American sailors used it on long voyages from 1770 onward to outrun scurvy. Captain James Cook carried 7,860 pounds of it aboard the Resolution. Your great-grandmother carried 40 pounds of it under her kitchen stairs. Then, in 1962, the National Canners Association lobbied successfully to have open crock fermentation reclassified as a, quote, uncontrolled process, unsuitable for home use. The Ball Corporation quietly pivoted its educational pamphlets toward pressure canning, which required buying a $30 pressure canner and replacement gaskets every 2 years. And within a decade, the stoneware crock had become a flower planter on a front porch. Nobody banned cabbage. They just made the slow way feel reckless. Number 4. Pemmican. Before 1880, the Plains Cree, the Métis Trading Companies, and the Hudson's Bay Company moved roughly 200,000 pounds of pemmican a year across the North American interior because no other food on Earth packed 3,500 calories per pound, kept for 10 years at room temperature, and required no cooking. The recipe is 3 ingredients: lean meat, usually bison or venison, sliced thin against the grain and dried at 160 degrees Fahrenheit until brittle, and then pounded to a coarse powder on a clean slab of slate. Rendered tallow, heated hot but not smoking, strained twice through cheesecloth, and a small fraction of dried berries, traditionally Saskatoons or chokecherries, for vitamin C and trace antioxidants that prevent the fat from going rancid. Equal parts powdered meat and tallow by weight, mixed warm, pressed into hide bags, or, by 1890, into waxed cotton sacks of roughly 2 pounds each. The fat seals the dry meat from oxygen and microbes simultaneously. The moisture content drops below 10%, and the food becomes essentially shelf-stable indefinitely. United States Army Quartermaster reports from 1862 list pemmican rations issued to scouts at 1 pound per day per man, 3 meals worth in a single hand-sized brick. Then the transcontinental railroads arrived. Refrigerated boxcars killed the long-haul protein market, and by 1920, the United States Department of War had stopped procuring it entirely. Hershey took the survival ration contract in 1937 with the D-ration chocolate bar at 600 calories per ounce. The Quartermaster Corps shifted to canned C rations, and pemmican became a forgotten word inside a single generation. Your grandfather might still have known what it was. Your father almost certainly did not. Number 5. The Vinegar Cellar Tonic Shelf. In 1923, the Mother's Friend Almanac distributed free to 1.4 million American farm households by the J.R. Watkins Company of Winona, Minnesota, devoted 12 pages to what it called the vinegar shelf. The idea was that a quart of raw, unpasteurized apple cider vinegar, started from windfall apples each September and held in a dark cellar at 55 degrees Fahrenheit, became the household's pharmacy for the year. Honey and vinegar at a 1-to-1 ratio for sore throats. A tablespoon every 2 hours. Vinegar and willow bark steeped for 10 days for fevers. Garlic steeped in vinegar for 60 days as a broad-spectrum antimicrobial, good for everything from earaches to infected splinters. Horseradish root in vinegar for sinus congestion. Mullein leaf in vinegar for coughs. The active mechanism is real and well documented. Acetic acid at 5% concentration kills most surface bacteria within 4 minutes, extracts fat-soluble plant compounds the way ethanol does at half the alcohol content, and preserves the resulting tincture indefinitely at cellar temperature. A typical farm pantry held 12 to 15 labeled jars on a single dedicated shelf, each one a remedy for a specific complaint. Then, in 1938, the new Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act gave the FDA authority over any product making a health claim, and within 6 years, the major almanac publishers had stripped every therapeutic vinegar reference from their pages under threat of federal injunction. Bayer aspirin filled the gap at the drugstore counter. Your grandmother's pharmacy used to live on a shelf above the potatoes. Number 6. The Rendered Lye Soap Kettle. A 1941 Tennessee Valley Authority Bulletin, distributed to roughly 90,000 rural households across 7 southern states, taught the standard farm soap recipe in plain numbers. 6 pounds of saved kitchen fat, 12 ounces of sodium hydroxide lye, 2 3/4 pints of soft rainwater, stirred slowly in a cast iron kettle over a low fire until the mixture traced like cold honey on the back of a wooden spoon. Then poured into a wooden box lined with old flour sacks and cut into bars after 48 hours of cooling. 1 kettle yielded roughly 70 bars of soap, enough to last a family of 6 a full year, at a 1941 cost of about 41 cents in store-bought lye. The chemistry is saponification. Lye hydrolyzes triglycerides into glycerin and the sodium salts of fatty acids. The reaction is complete and self-limiting, and properly cured for 6 weeks on an open shelf, the soap is gentle enough for laundry, dishes, infant skin, and shaving. Countrywomen had been doing this for 2 centuries, using wood ashes leached through a barrel to make their own potash lye. But by 1941, the Bulletin assumed store-bought sodium hydroxide because the price had dropped to 9 cents a can at any general store. Then, in 1946, Procter & Gamble launched Tide as the first synthetic detergent, spent the equivalent of 200 million modern dollars on radio advertising in the first 3 years, and by 1953, home soap making had collapsed below 2% of American households. Nobody outlawed wood ashes. They just gave you a brighter box. Number 7. The maple sap tap line. This is the one I mentioned at the top. In 1955, a Vermont sugar bush of roughly 400 maple trees, hand-tapped with metal spiles and galvanized buckets, yielded between 100 and 160 gallons of finished syrup, at a wholesale price of about $6 a gallon, which is roughly $70 in today's money. A family that owned 40 acres of mixed northern hardwood could net $3,000 to $4,000 in a 6-week window every March from a tree species that grew on its own with no fertilizer, no pesticide, no irrigation, and no replanting. The mechanism is freeze-thaw pressure. As night temperatures drop below 32 degrees Fahrenheit and day temperatures rise above 40, the maple xylem pumps sap upward under positive pressure, and a single tap hole at chest height yields roughly 10 gallons of 2% sugar sap per tree per season. Boil it down 40 to 1 over an open wood fire, and you have syrup. A family with 20 trees could produce 20 gallons of syrup in a season, half for use and half for trade, and a single quart bartered in 1955 for a pair of work boots at the general store. Then in 1968, the Vermont Department of Agriculture introduced its first grading regulations. The upfront cost of compliant equipment, stainless evaporator pans, certified hydrometers, sealed bottling rooms, jumped from about $80 to nearly $600 within 5 years. And by 1980, small backyard sugaring had been pushed out of the commercial market entirely. The trees did not change. The paperwork did. If this video is helping you think about household self-reliance differently, a quick like helps the channel keep making this kind of content. Completely up to you. Just wanted to mention it. Number 8. The threaded dried fruit string. Walk into any Appalachian kitchen between 1890 and 1955 in late September, and you would see a string of dried apple slices hanging from a rafter beam, sometimes 12 feet long, sometimes longer, sometimes 3 strings in parallel across the entire ceiling above the wood stove. The technique was called leather breeches when applied to green beans, and snits when applied to apples. The method is simple and almost free. Slice the fruit a 1/4 inch thick. Peel optional. Core optional. Blanch briefly in lemon water if you want to prevent browning. Then thread a long darning needle with clean cotton string and hang the loops in a dry attic or above a wood stove where the ambient temperature held at 90 to 110 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 to 5 days. The fruit lost roughly 80% of its water by weight. The sugar concentration rose above 65%, which is the threshold where mold can no longer grow. And a single string held 2 to 3 pounds of finished dried apples that would keep for 18 months in a paper sack hung in a dry cupboard. The energy cost was zero because the heat was already there for cooking. The labor cost was about an hour per string. The shelf life beat anything in the grocery store, and the flavor was not even close. Then in 1956, General Foods launched the freeze-dried fruit packet for the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. By 1965, the supermarket sold dried apples in cellophane bags at 20 times the per-pound cost of home drying, and the strings came down off the rafters. Your grandmother did not buy snack packs. She walked to the rafter, lifted down a string still warm from the wood stove below, and snapped off 2 slices for a child standing in the doorway with a school satchel. Number 9. The smoked herb cache. Long before refrigeration, almost every farmhouse in the southern Appalachians and the upper South kept a small wooden box, sometimes a tin pail with a tight-fitting lid, hanging in the rafters of the smokehouse 3 to 4 feet above the curing meat. Inside the box went the year's culinary and medicinal herbs: sage, thyme, oregano, hyssop, mountain mint, yarrow, mullein, lobelia for asthma, and tobacco leaves saved for poultices on infected wounds. The cold smoke from a smoldering hickory or apple fire drifted upward at roughly 80 degrees Fahrenheit, deposited a thin, invisible layer of phenolic compounds on the dried leaves, and gave each herb a shelf life of 3 to 4 years instead of the usual 6 months. The phenols, primarily guaiacol and syringol, are natural antimicrobials and antioxidants. A 1939 University of Kentucky Agricultural Extension Circular documented that smoked sage retained 78% of its volatile oils after 2 years, compared to about 12% for paper-bagged sage. And the antimicrobial activity of smoked yarrow against Staphylococcus aureus was measurably higher than the unsmoked control. The cache also doubled as a slow-drying chamber. Fresh herbs cut in August went up green and came down crisp by November, perfectly preserved without an oven, a dehydrator, or a single watt of electricity. Then in 1958, McCormick and Company opened its first centralized spice irradiation facility in Hunt Valley, Maryland. The dried herb aisle filled with little glass jars at 6 times the per-ounce cost of home drying. And within a decade, the rafter cache was gone. The smokehouse went with it, and so did the quiet knowledge that the same fire could preserve 2 different things at once. Number 10. The brine-cured egg crock. Before the household refrigerator became universal in 1948, An American farm flock of 15 hens laying through May produced roughly 200 eggs a week, 5 times more than the family could eat fresh. The standard solution, documented in detail in the 1919 USDA Farmer's Bulletin 19, was a 5-gallon stoneware crock filled with a sodium silicate solution at 1 part water glass to 9 parts boiled, cooled water. Fresh, unwashed eggs went in, pointy end down. The silicate sealed the porous shell against air exchange, and the eggs kept for 8 to 10 months at cellar temperature, with no measurable loss of cooking quality. A single crock held about 15 dozen eggs. The cost of the water glass in 1919 was around 30 cents at any drugstore. And a family could eat homestead eggs every Sunday from May through the following March. The science is straightforward. Sodium silicate, also called liquid glass, forms a microscopically thin mineral coating that blocks the carbon dioxide loss responsible for ordinary egg spoilage, and seals out the bacteria responsible for the dangerous spoilage. Tested at the University of Wisconsin in 1923, water-glassed eggs held for 9 months scored statistically indistinguishable from same-day fresh eggs on a panel of 40 bakers. Then, in 1947, General Electric launched the dual-temperature refrigerator-freezer combination at $279. The egg industry consolidated into year-round factory laying houses by 1962, and water glassing dropped out of the extension literature entirely by 1968. The crock is still in the barn. Your grandparents just stopped using it. Number 11. The braided allium ceiling. Open the ceiling beam of any 1920s Italian-American, Greek-American, or French-Canadian kitchen, and you would find a braided rope of garlic, shallots, or storage onions hanging in open air over the kitchen table. The braid was not decoration. Properly cured alliums, meaning the necks dried for 2 weeks in shade until papery and the outer skins gone brittle, then woven on twine in groups of 15 to 20 bulbs per braid, kept for 8 to 10 months at room temperature with roughly 4% loss per month. A family that planted 200 garlic cloves in October could harvest 200 bulbs the following July, hang 4 braids of 50 bulbs each in the kitchen, and use fresh garlic continuously until the next spring's green garlic was ready in April. The mechanism is the bulb's own dormancy biology. As long as the neck stays dry and air can move around the bulb, the plant remains alive in a suspended state, hormonally programmed not to sprout until a cold spell breaks dormancy. A 1953 University of California Davis study documented that braided storage garlic at 65 degrees Fahrenheit and 60% humidity lost 7% of weight in 7 months versus 41% for the same bulbs stored loose in a paper bag. Then, in 1958, California garlic growers, later renamed Christopher Ranch, began contracting with Kroger to supply pre-peeled garlic in plastic jars. The price of fresh storage garlic at supermarket dropped by 60%. And by 1975, home garlic curing had collapsed everywhere, except a few Italian neighborhoods in Brooklyn, Chicago, and Providence. A hardware store sells you twine for 40 cents. The rest is just patience. Number 12. The cellar-aged hard cider barrel. In 1908, the United States produced roughly 55 million gallons of hard cider on small farms. Almost all of it fermented in 30 to 50-gallon oak barrels in unheated stone cellars at 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. The process was nearly hands-off. Press the September windfall apples through a screw press. Pour the raw juice into a clean barrel, still wet from a sulfur rinse. Install an airlock made of a clay pipe and a pan of water, and let the wild yeast already present on the apple skins carry the natural sugars down to about 6% alcohol over 4 months. A 50-gallon barrel cost about $4 in 1908 and held roughly the calorie equivalent of 200 pounds of fresh apples in a form that kept until the next harvest and tasted better the longer it sat. Most farm households drank cider with every meal because the alcohol made the water in it microbiologically safe in an era before chlorinated municipal supply. And a typical adult consumed 2 to 3 pints a day with no noticeable intoxication because the cider was sipped slowly and metabolized over the course of physical labor. Then Prohibition arrived in 1920. The federal government dispatched Treasury agents to chop down an estimated 4 million cider apple trees across New England and the upper Midwest between 1920 and 1925. The orchard cider industry collapsed inside 3 years. And even after repeal in 1933, the Federal Treasury Department's new excise structure made small-scale cider production economically unworkable for anyone but commercial wineries. Anheuser-Busch took the alcohol market with its 1933 St. Louis reopening and a federally subsidized national distribution contract by 1936. The cider barrel went into the woodpile. The apples kept falling. There are old farm orchards in upstate New York and central Pennsylvania where the September ground is still ankle-deep in unpicked windfall every year. Fruit that fed a household for a century and now feeds the deer. Somewhere between 1948 and 1980, the American household quietly stopped being a place where food and medicine and soap and protein were made, and started being a place where those things were stored after somebody else made them somewhere far away. The cellar emptied. The smokehouse rotted in the back lot. The crock cracked in the corner of a barn, and nobody replaced it. The braids came down off the kitchen rafter, and a wire basket of Christopher Ranch garlic took their place. A generation that could walk into a November pantry and read it the way you read a map gave way to a generation that reads a barcode. None of this was a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It was something quieter and more efficient than that. Each step, each new appliance, each new regulation, each new convenience food shelf at the A&P transferred one small piece of the household's autonomy into somebody else's revenue line. The forgetting was profitable for someone else. And that is the whole story in one sentence. Your grandparents kept the chain alive longer than most of us realize. They were the last full generation that knew this material in their hands, not in a book. Your generation is the one that gets to decide whether the chain breaks on your watch or starts being mended on it. Neither outcome is inevitable. The choice sits on your kitchen table. Pick one trick this week, just one. Maybe it is the salt-cured bacon. Maybe it is a stoneware crock of kraut on your kitchen counter. Maybe it is 15 pounds of garlic braided in your hallway by August. Maybe it is nothing more ambitious than a single quart of homemade apple cider vinegar started from a windfall bag and tucked into a cabinet for the winter. Pick the one that catches in your chest a little, the one that feels less like a chore and more like a memory you have not made yet. Tell me in the comments which one you are trying first, and tell me which grandparent put it there in your head. Because somewhere back along that line, there is a person who already knew this, and you are the one who gets to remember it for them.